the city, life moved slowly. Small houses stood side by side along dusty roads, and the laughter of children often echoed through the evening air. It was the kind of place where neighbors knew one another and stories were shared under the moonlight. But on a rainy night many years ago, tragedy struck a young family living in that town. A terrible motor accident took the lives of two loving parents. The news spread quickly through the neighborhood, leaving everyone shocked and heartbroken. The couple had been known for their kindness and their dreams for the future. What made the tragedy even more painful was the fact that they had left behind a baby girl who was only a few months old. Her name was Juliet. With her parents gone, the responsibility of raising the little girl fell to her grandmother, an elderly woman whose back had already begun to bend with age. Though life had not been easy for her, she refused to let the child grow up without love. She took Juliet into her small home and raised her as best as she could. The house was simple, made of old wood and rusted roofing sheets that rattled whenever the wind blew. But inside that little house was warmth and care. Juliet's grandmother told her stories every night before she slept. Stories about courage, kindness, and the importance of doing what is right. Even though they did not have much money, the old woman worked hard to provide food for the little girl. She sold roasted corn and groundnuts by the roadside every day under the hot sun. Sometimes Juliet would sit beside her, watching the cars pass by and listening to her grandmother greet customers with a gentle smile. Life may be hard, her grandmother would often say, but a good heart will always guide you. For the first 10 years of her life, Juliet felt safe in that small world. She grew into a cheerful child with bright eyes and a curious mind. She loved to watch people, wondering about their stories and where they were going. In many ways, she was just like any other child her age. But fate was not finished testing her. As the years passed, Juliet's grandmother grew weaker. The long days of work and the weight of age slowly drained her strength. One evening, as the sun dipped below the horizon and painted the sky with shades of orange and purple, the old woman sat quietly outside their house. Juliet noticed something unusual. Her grandmother looked tired, more tired than she had ever seen before. That night, she did not tell her usual bedtime stories. Instead, she held Juliet's small hands and looked at her with deep, loving eyes. "My child," she said softly, "no matter what happens in life, always remember to stay strong." Juliet did not fully understand those words at the time. She simply nodded and hugged her grandmother tightly. But by the next morning, everything had changed. The old woman who had protected Juliet from the harshness of the world was gone. For the 10-year-old girl, it felt as though the ground beneath her feet had disappeared. The house that once felt warm and safe suddenly felt empty. Neighbors tried to help for a while, offering food and kind words, but everyone had their own struggles, their own families to care for. Slowly, the attention faded. Days passed, then weeks, and before long, Juliet found herself standing alone in a world that was far too big for a child. With no parents, no grandmother, and no one willing to take responsibility for her, Juliet was forced to leave the only home she had ever known. That was the day her life on the streets began. The busy city became her new reality, a place filled with noise, rushing vehicles, and strangers who barely noticed her existence. At first, Juliet believed someone would come to help, but as the days turned to months, she began to realize something painful. In the crowded streets of the city, it was very easy for a lonely child to be forgotten. And so, the young girl who once listened to bedtime stories under a loving roof began learning how to survive in a world that showed her very little kindness. Little did she know that the path ahead of her would be filled with struggles, difficult choices, and a twist of fate that would change her life forever. The first few days on the streets were the hardest days Juliet had ever experienced. She was only 10 years old, small and frightened, standing alone in a busy city that seemed to move too fast for someone like her. Everywhere she looked, people were rushing from one place to another, cars honking, traders shouting, motorcycles speeding past. But no one noticed the lonely little girl standing at the edge of the road. At night, the streets became colder and more frightening. Juliet had no bed, no blanket, and no one to hold her close the way her grandmother used to. She curled up beside closed shops or under small shelters, hoping the darkness would protect her from danger. Hunger quickly became her greatest enemy. Sometimes kind strangers would give her leftover food. Other times she had to search through waste bins, hoping to find something she could eat. Each day was a struggle, and each night felt longer than the last. At first, Juliet cried often. She cried for her parents she had never known. She cried for the grandmother who had loved her, and she cried for the life that had suddenly disappeared. But the streets have a way of changing people. As weeks turned into months, Juliet slowly learned the harsh roles of survivor. She observed the other street children and watched how they managed to get food and avoid trouble. Some washed car windshields at traffic lights to earn a few coins. Some carried loads in the market for traders. Others simply begged from people passing by. Juliet tried all of these things. On good days, she managed to earn enough money to buy a small plate of food. On bad days, she went to sleep with an empty stomach. Years passed. The little girl who had once sat beside her grandmother selling roasted corn slowly grew into a young woman. By the age of 23, Juliet had spent more than half her life on the streets. The world had hardened her. Her once bright and curious eyes now carried the weight of many difficult experiences. She had seen things most people could never imagine: fights, cruelty, betrayal, and the constant struggle to stay alive. Sometimes she remembered her grandmother's words: "Life may be hard, but a good heart will guide you." Juliet wanted to live by those words, but life on the street rarely gives people many choices. There were days when hunger became so painful that it felt like a fire burning inside her stomach. On those days, desperation would take over. Slowly, Juliet began doing something she had once promised herself she would never do. She started stealing. At first, it was small things: an orange from a fruit stand, a loaf of bread from a busy shop, or leftover food when no one was watching. Each time she did it, guilt filled her heart. She would remember her grandmother's voice telling her to be honest. But hunger has a powerful way of silencing guilt. Juliet often told herself that she had no other choice. Despite everything, she was not a bad person. Deep down, she still carried the kindness her grandmother had taught her. Sometimes she shared food with younger street children who had nothing to eat. Sometimes she helped older women carry heavy bags across the road. But kindness alone could not change the harsh reality of her life. One hot afternoon, as the sun burned brightly above the busy market road, Juliet walked slowly through a line of roadside food sellers. The smell of freshly cooked rice and fried meat filled the air. Her stomach growled loudly. She had not eaten since the previous day. Juliet stopped near a small food stand where a woman was busy serving customers. Large pots of steaming food sat on the table: rice, beans, stew, and fried plantains. Juliet stood there quietly, watching. Her mind was fighting a silent battle. Part of her wanted to walk away, but another part of her, the part that had gone too many days without food, was telling her to take the risk. She looked around carefully. The seller was distracted. Customers were arguing about change. No one seemed to be paying attention to her. Slowly, Juliet stretched out her hand toward a plate of food resting on the edge of the table. Her heart began to beat faster. Just one plate, she told herself, just enough to stop the hunger. But the moment her fingers touched the plate, a loud voice suddenly shouted from behind her, "Hey, thief!" Juliet froze. Two strong men had been watching her from across the road. Within seconds, they began running after her. Fear rushed through her body like a sudden storm. Without thinking, Juliet grabbed the plate and started running. The men chased after her, shouting loudly and pushing their way through the crowded roadside market. People turned their heads to see what was happening. Juliet ran as fast as her legs could carry her. She pushed through the crowd and sprinted towards the busy road ahead, desperate to escape. But in her panic, she made a terrible mistake. She did not look to see what was coming. At that exact moment, a car was speeding down the road. and before anyone could react, Juliet ran straight into its path. The sound of screeching tires filled the air. Then everything went silent. The driver quickly stepped on the brakes as people nearby began shouting in shock. Juliet's body lay motionless on the side of the road. Within seconds, the driver of the car jumped out in fear and rushed towards the injured girl. But when he finally looked closely at her face, something about her seemed strangely familiar, something that would soon change both of their lives forever. The crowd gathered quickly around the accident scene. People whispered among themselves as they looked at the young woman lying on the roadside. Some shook their heads sadly, while others tried to push closer to see what had happened. The driver of the car stood frozen for a moment, his heart pounding heavily in his chest. The suddenness of the accident had shocked him deeply. He had tried. He truly had. But everything had happened too quickly. Taking a deep breath, the man hurried toward the injured girl. Several people were already standing around her, murmuring worriedly. "Move back," he said urgently. "Give her some space." Kneeling beside her, he carefully looked at her face. Her clothes were old and dusty, and her hair was rough from years of hardship. It was clear that life had not been kind to her. Yet, as the man studied her face more closely, something strange stirred inside him. There was something familiar about her. At first, he thought it was just his imagination. After all, the city was full of people. Faces often reminded you of someone else. But the feeling did not go away. Instead, it grew stronger. He looked again. Her eyes were closed, but the shape of her face, the curve of her nose, even the small birthmark near her left eyebrow. His heart skipped a beat. He had seen that birthmark before, many years ago. Quickly, he pushed the thought away. It was impossible, he told himself. The person he was thinking about had disappeared long ago. Still, he could not ignore the strange feeling growing inside him. "Is she alive?" someone in the crowd asked. The man gently placed his hand near her nose to check her breathing. A moment later, he let out a small sigh of relief. "She's still breathing," he said. Without wasting another second, he stood up and shouted, "Someone help me carry her to the car. We need to take her to the hospital now." Two men from the crowd stepped forward and helped lift Juliet carefully into the back seat of the car. Within minutes, the vehicle sped away toward the nearest hospital. The hospital emergency room was filled with activity when they arrived. Doctors and nurses quickly rushed Juliet onto a stretcher and wheeled her inside for treatment. The driver remained outside the room, pacing nervously. Every few seconds, he glanced toward the door, hoping for good news. His mind was racing with thoughts. He had never seen the girl before. At least that was what he believed. Yet that strange feeling of familiarity would not leave him alone. He sat down heavily on a nearby chair and buried his face in his hands. Memories from long ago began rising slowly in his mind. Memories of a tragic accident. Many years earlier, when he was still a young boy, his family had been involved in a terrible crash. His parents had died that day, but he had survived. The accident had separated him from the rest of his family, and in the confusion that followed, his baby sister had disappeared. For years, he had searched for her. Hospitals, orphanages, police records, anywhere that might lead him to her. But the search had never brought answers. Eventually, life forced him to move forward, though the question had always remained in his heart. What had happened to his little sister? Now, sitting in the hospital hallway, that same question suddenly returned stronger than ever. He remembered the tiny baby he had last seen wrapped in a blanket. He remembered one small detail his grandmother used to talk about, a birthmark above the left eyebrow. The man slowly lifted his head. His heart began to beat faster. The injured girl in the hospital room had the same birthmark. "No," he whispered to himself. "It can't be." He stood up and began walking slowly toward the door of the emergency room. Just as he reached it, a doctor stepped out. "Doctor," the man asked anxiously, "how is she?" The doctor removed his gloves and nodded calmly. She's lucky, the injuries are serious, but she will survive. Relief washed over the man like a wave. Can I see her? He asked. The doctor hesitated for a moment, then nodded. Just for a short time, she's still unconscious. The man stepped quietly into the room. Juliet lay on the hospital bed with bandages around her head and arm. Machines beside her made soft beeping sounds as they monitored her condition. He walked slowly closer. Standing beside the bed, he looked at her again. This time, there was no doubt about what he saw. That birthmark, that same mark he remembered from childhood. His heart began to tremble slightly. Could it really be possible? Could the girl he had accidentally hit with his car be the sister he had spent years searching for? Or was it simply a cruel coincidence? He pulled a chair closer and sat beside the bed, staring at her face. For the first time in many years, hope began to rise quietly in his heart. But the truth was something he had yet to discover. And when Juliet finally opened her eyes, the answers waiting ahead would change both of their lives forever. The hospital room was quiet, except for the soft sound of the machines beside Juliet's bed. The man sat patiently in the chair next to her, watching carefully for any sign that she might wake up. Hours passed slowly. Outside the window, the evening sky began to darken, and the lights of the city flickered on one by one. Yet the man remained there, unable to leave. Too many thoughts were running through his mind. Could this truly be his sister, or was he simply hoping for something that wasn't real? He leaned back in the chair and sighed quietly. For many years, he had searched for answers about his family. After the accident that took their parents, everything had fallen apart so quickly. He remembered waking up in the hospital as a child, confused and injured. People had told him that his parents were gone, but what hurt him even more was learning that his baby sister had disappeared during the chaos that followed the accident. No one knew where she had gone. Some believed she had been taken to another hospital. Others thought someone from the family might have taken her away. But after months of searching, no one could find her. As the years passed, hope slowly faded. Still, he had never truly stopped wondering about her. And now, sitting beside the hospital bed, the possibility that she might be alive filled his heart with both hope and fear. Suddenly, Juliet moved slightly. The man quickly leaned forward. Her fingers twitched and her eyelids slowly began to open. For a moment, she looked confused, staring at the bright hospital lights above her. Then she turned her head slightly and noticed the man sitting beside her. Her voice came out weak and dry. "Where am I?" "You are in the hospital," the man replied gently. "You were hit by a car, but the doctors treated you." Juliet blinked slowly as she tried to remember what had happened. Then the memory came rushing back. The food store, the men chasing her, the road, and the sound of the car. Fear flashed across her face. I didn't mean to steal," she whispered weakly. "I was just hungry." The man felt a deep sadness in his chest as he heard her words. "You don't have to worry about that right now. You are safe." Juliet looked at him carefully. "Are you the one who hit me?" she asked. The man nodded slowly. "Yes," he admitted. "It was an accident. I tried to stop." Juliet closed her eyes for a moment, then opened them again. "Thank you for bringing me here," she said softly. There was silence in the room for a few seconds. The man hesitated before speaking again. "There's something I want to ask you," he said. Juliet looked at him curiously. "What is it?" "Do you remember your parents?" he asked gently. Juliet shook her head slowly. "No, they died when I was a baby. At least that's what my grandmother told me." The man's heart began beating faster. "And your grandmother," he continued. "She raised me, but she died when I was 10. Her voice became quieter as she spoke. After that, I had no one." The man swallowed hard. Everything she was saying matched the story he had been told many years ago. He leaned slightly closer. "Did your grandmother ever tell you anything about your family?" he asked carefully. Juliet thought for a moment. "Only a little," she said. She once told me I had an older brother who survived the accident that killed my parents. The man's hands trembled slightly. What, what was your grandmother's name? Juliet answered without hesitation. Grace. At that moment, the man felt his entire body go still. Grace had been his grandmother's name. There was no doubt left in his mind. He looked at Juliet with wide eyes, struggling to control his emotions. Juliet, he said softly. Yes? There's something you need to know. She looked at him curiously, wondering why his voice had suddenly become so serious. The man took a deep breath. For many years, I've been searching for my missing sister. Juliet's eyes widened slightly. And everything you've told me, the accident, our grandmother, even the birthmark above your eyebrow. He paused for a moment, his voice trembling. I think you might be her. Juliet stared in disbelief. The room suddenly felt very quiet. Her heart began beating faster as she tried to understand what he was saying. That's impossible, she whispered. The man slowly shook his head. My name is Daniel, and Juliet, I believe I am your brother. Tears began forming in Juliet's eyes. For years, she had believed she was completely alone in the world. Now, suddenly, someone was telling her she still had family. But after a lifetime of hardship, it was difficult for her to believe it so easily. She looked at him carefully, searching his face. Are you sure? She asked softly. Daniel nodded slowly. There's only one way to be completely certain. We can take a DNA test. He reached out gently and held her hand. But deep down, I already know. For the first time in many years, Juliet felt something she had almost forgotten. Hope. Yet, the final truth still remained to be confirmed. And when that moment came, it would change both of their lives forever. The hospital room was filled with a silence that felt heavier than words. Juliet lay on the bed, staring at Daniel, trying to understand everything he had just said. For most of her life, she had believed she was completely alone in the world. The idea that she might still have family felt almost impossible. Yet the way Daniel looked at her was different from how strangers usually looked at her. There was concern in his eyes. There was hope. And something deeper. Something that felt like a connection. Neither of them spoke for a while. Finally, Daniel cleared his throat gently. I know this is a lot to take in, he said softly, but we can confirm the truth. The doctors can arrange a DNA test. Juliet nodded slowly. She was still unsure what to believe, but something inside her told her that she should at least find out the truth. Okay, she whispered. Over the next few days, Juliet remained in the hospital recovering from her injuries. The doctor said she was lucky. The accident could have been much worse. During those days, Daniel visited her often. Sometimes they talked about small things, what life had been like for each of them over the years. Juliet told him about her grandmother and the small wooden house where she had spent the first 10 years of her life. She told him how her grandmother used to sell roasted corn by the roadside and how she would tell stories every night before Juliet slept. Daniel listened carefully to every detail. Everything she said matched the memories he had of their grandmother. In return, Daniel shared his own story. After the accident, he had been taken in by a distant relative who lived in another city. Life had been difficult for him as well, but he was fortunate enough to finish school and eventually build a stable life for himself. Still, he had never stopped thinking about the baby sister who had disappeared after the accident. I searched for you for years, Daniel said one evening as he sat beside her hospital bed. Juliet looked at him quietly. I thought no one was looking for me, she admitted. Daniel shook his head. I never gave up completely, he said. A few days later, the hospital called them with the results of the DNA test. Daniel and Juliet sat together in the doctor's office as the doctor reviewed the report. The doctor looked up and smiled gently. He said, the test confirms it. You are siblings. For a moment, neither of them spoke. Juliet felt tears slowly filling her eyes. All the years of loneliness, the nights spent sleeping on cold streets, the hunger, the feeling that the world had forgotten her. And now, suddenly, she had family again. Daniel's eyes also filled with emotion. He stood up and carefully walked over to her. Without saying a word, he wrapped his arms around his sister. Juliet held on to him tightly. For the first time since she was a child, she felt the comfort of family again. In the weeks that followed, Juliet's life began to change. After she was discharged from the hospital, Daniel took her to live with him. He helped her get proper medical care and made sure she had everything she needed to start a new life. The streets that had once been her home slowly became a distant memory. It wasn't easy for Juliet to adjust at first. After spending so many years struggling to survive, it took time for her to believe that her life had truly changed. But Daniel remained patient. He encouraged her to learn new skills, rebuild her confidence, and believe in a future that once seemed impossible. Little by little, Juliet began to rediscover the kindness and hope her grandmother had once taught her. One evening, as they sat together watching the sunset, Juliet smiled softly. She said, "My grandmother used to say something." Daniel looked at her. What was it? She used to say that even when life becomes very hard, a good heart will always guide you. Daniel smiled. It seems she was right. Juliet nodded. Despite everything she had been through, she had survived long enough for fate to bring her back to the only family she had left. Sometimes, life takes people through dark and difficult paths. But as Juliet had learned, destiny can still lead them back to where they belong. And in the end, the girl who once believed she had no one discovered that her story was not one of loss. It was a story of finding family again.